Okay. Welcome to Math 119-312. I think this is lecture 14. And we are very excited to have a graduate of Williams College, Dr. McCullough, who will be talking to us about medical ethics. So you should all have hopefully read the packet we sent. He is currently an adjunct professor of ethics at Cornell University in New York. And so I'm going to pass off the class. So thank you again for coming. And I will just help moderate the discussion. Did you want to start off with any questions or comments or discussion items, or would you like me to raise some issues?
Hey, why don't you raise some issues?
Sure. So I had a 40-minute conversation with one of my students earlier today about whether or not he should apply to graduate school this year or not. And a lot of graduate programs have said that they are not going to have any acceptances this year. They have to cut back for viruses. Reasons. And so one of the things we were talking about is what are the right levels of precautions to take. So in particular, I've been talking to some people in the medical industry who are saying that we might have vaccines or at least testing with rapid results in the next couple of months, which will be a in terms of how things are dealt with. And one of the items we talked about is what could we have done to get a vaccine faster? So for instance, could you have talked to people who are facing a death sentence in jail and had them become guinea pigs for vaccines? What about people who have life in prison? What are the ethical issues in terms of allowing people to make a choice of whether or not they want to be deliberately vaccinated and then infected in order to get information faster? I know we have some science fiction fans in the audience. Issues like this have been explored in a lot of science fiction novels in terms of organ donation, in terms of what do we allow people to do or not to do. So I thought I would just throw that out there as a start and see what people want to say, using, if possible, the language that we were reading about.
Steve, do you want me to address that first or have the students go first?
If you want to say a few words to just put it in context, that would be great.
Okay.
And you can rephrase in case I did a bad job.
No, I mean, the ethics of, this is under the ethics of research with human subjects. And when you're introducing a vaccine, there's a responsibility of the manufacturer actually it's under American law, to assure the FDA that the vaccine is effective, that is, it provokes an immune response that then protects the patient in the future, and that it's safe. That doesn't mean completely safe. It means that any side effects of the vaccine are worth taking given the gravity of illness we're trying to prevent. So the ethics of research is not based on whether someone wants to become a research subject. It's based on the obligation to produce a safe and effective vaccine in research that protects human subjects.
I'm going to just mute everybody for a second, and then I'm going to have you unmute yourself.
Okay, is that better?
Yeah, I think that's better. That cuts down on the background noise. And if anybody wants to speak up, just unmute yourself.
Yeah, so I mean, there's an obligation to protect human subjects, including from themselves, from the problem of enthusiasm, that is believing that something will work even though it has never been proven to work. The concern about prison populations is that that's an intrinsically coercive environment. And so while someone may understand the nature of research on a vaccine and its risks, it's not clear that they can make a voluntary decision that is free of controlling influences. So this is an area that's very well understood in research ethics. What I've just said has been stable for the last 4 or 5 decades. So this is an area where medical ethics has actually established standards. These are internationally recognized standards. Thus, there is great concern about the vaccine research on COVID-19 going on in Russia because they are skipping what are called phase 3 trials. That's where you randomly assign patients either to the vaccine or a placebo, and that's where you're studying for safety and effectiveness. So Russia is in violation of internationally accepted standards of the ethics of research.
So does anybody want to comment on this?
Are there any conversations going on as to whether the standards of the last several decades are still appropriate?
That's a good question. For vaccine research, the answer is no. The difference this time is that the speed with which the vaccine trials are going on is unprecedented. That's normal because for example, the flu vaccine is developed in anticipation of what the variant on the flu virus is going to be. It's typically not developed in the middle of a pandemic. So the urgency led to speeding up the trials, but as Dr. Fauci made very clear last night on 60 Minutes, the standards for evaluating the outcomes of those trials will not change. A crucial role in that is what's called the Data and Safety Monitoring Board. These are set up by the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, and report directly to the director. They are independent of the investigators. They're independent of the vaccine companies. I have served on about 8 or 9 of these boards for the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute on various heart disease trials. And the DSMB, as it's called, will review the results, and then it will go to FDA internal scientific review. There's then an FDA external scientific review, and then the leadership of Dr. Fauci's institute, which is sponsoring these trials, will review the data, and only then would a vaccine be eligible for approval under emergency use, that is, to be deployed rapidly. If that all happens, then it will take several months to start vaccinating people, mounting a vaccine for the whole country. 330 million people is a formidable undertaking. As I learned yesterday, each year we vaccinate about 100 million for the flu vaccine. That's done over several months period. As you all know, that the vaccine became available for the flu in September. Please get your shot unless you've got medical reason not to have one. To do 330 million people is going to take a lot longer than that. But no, there's no change in the standards whatsoever, and that's because of the history of the failure to abide by those standards has led to bad outcomes.
Have there been any major events that have led to significant changes in the past few decades? Not to the level we're talking about now, but where people have rethought?
Well, no, I think no. These are very stable. I mean, there's a professional responsibility of physicians and other healthcare professionals to see to it that any treatment they provide to patients, including in this case preventive medicine, is safe and effective. And that standard has been very solid, and as people nobody can, I think, would realistically be able to challenge that. It's that stable.
But, so this is where I'm going to try to use my physics degree. So special relativity is very counterintuitive. You can't travel faster than the speed of light, and most of us have no experience in something like that. How much of our medical ethics right now do you think would still hold true if we had a plague of epic proportions far worse than we had now, where say the death rate was around 95%?
That's a very good question. There's a standard response to that among physicians who haven't thought carefully about it, and it's desperate cases justify desperate measures. The problem with that is the history of the use of desperate measures in the history of medicine is very mixed. There have been some successes, there have been some failures, And so even in a desperate circumstance, you would conduct the research according to accepted standards. Now, would you try to do it as rapidly as possible? Would it be ethically permissible to alter study design so that you're working with incomplete data and relying on projection rather than data about risk? Those would be matters for discussion. So the urgency would certainly put pressure on the timetable to get it done. But to put a vaccine into the market without adequate testing could make everything much, much worse. See, there's an assumption that it will work and everybody will be fine, and that's the history of medicine tells a very different story.
No, I agree that that's an assumption, but if you do have, you know, say almost everybody coming down with it and almost everybody who gets it dying, this is beyond my experience. I don't know how things would react in a situation like that.
Well, what it would require is the prevention of enthusiasm in the medical community, and that's the belief in something in the absence of evidence. The classic example of that was mammary artery ligation for unstable angina, which was very commonly performed until it was shown in the clinical trial to be completely worthless, and it went away. It was never done again. No, that's a major surgery that had a significant morbidity and mortality associated with it. And see, it's lessons like that from which we have learned to go by the scientific book, even in desperate circumstances.
I have a family member whose heart has been compromised by medication and absolutely understand this issue. What about, could you tie this in with some work that's been done about allowing people to have experimental treatments, you know, before all the testing is done?
Right. Yeah. This is called compassionate use, and there is a great controversy about that. If the research has not yet been completed, then giving an experimental medication outside a clinical trial is indeed an experiment. Now that has a precise meaning. An experiment is a clinical intervention, the outcome of which cannot be reliably predicted. And if you provide it thinking it will help the patient, that's called enthusiasm, and enthusiasm is unprofessional. So one argument against compassionate use is that it's unprofessional practice. It encourages false beliefs in patients and society generally, and encourages false hope and should not be permitted. Another view is let patients decide for themselves if they want to do that. The problem with that view is that the patient isn't the only one affected by that decision. Society as well is, and then the whole discipline of scientific research to improve the quality of patient care breaks down. We've seen this in our current president, who has a belief that the regimen that he received, a bunch of which was experimental and done outside clinical trials, actually cured him. That belief is false. And is now shared by millions of people in the United States.
So related to this, do you have any sense of how often people are pushed into experimental treatments too early? I know this is a very vague question, but.
Well, there are two ways in which physicians can do experiments. One is in an organized clinical trial. You cannot do a clinical trial anywhere in the United States without the approval of what's called an institutional review board. And this is an independent entity that examines first for the scientific justification, then the clinical justification, then the ethical justification, and then the informed consent process and the safety measures. This has been settled practice in the United States for more than 4 decades. It's simply not permitted. The other was what's called innovation. That is, you do something new for which the outcome cannot be predicted, so it's an experiment. In 2008, the Society for University Surgeons created the ethical standard for this. Up until that point in the history of surgery, surgeons had innovated a lot. The mammary artery ligation is an example I just gave, with very mixed results. So what the Society of University Surgeons said is that there should be independent review of planned innovation so that it's done with scientific, clinical, and ethical justification. data are gathered about it that then become preliminary results for rapid transition to a clinical trial. I work in the area of what's called a fetal intervention, that is medical and surgical intervention to benefit a fetus in utero. And this is an area where that field has agreed that innovation should occur in a planned way with review. There are some outliers, and they are held in disrepute by the serious members of what's called the North American Fetal Therapy Network.
We had a question in the chat. Is there any standard regarding physicians publicly claiming miracle results or cures based on a limited number of cases with no controls?
Every medical student is taught that that's unprofessional behavior. So this is an area, there's no law against it, although it would, technically it could be made, you can make the case that it violates that state's Medical Practice Act because it is scientifically and clinically incompetent to declare success based on a small case series. Now, why is that? First of all, what counts as my experience varies all over the place. Second, there can be bias in case selection. That is, you don't do the experiment on where it looks like it might not work, so there's bias in the results and bias in the method. There are many, many scientific reasons. It's ethically not acceptable because it misleads people and misleads the public, and it's frequently done, one must be honest here, out of the economic and reputational self-interest of the physician promoting the so-called miracle cure. There's a long history of that in medicine, and again, very mixed. A lot of it worthless, and some of it beneficial, but only shown to be beneficial when subject to clinical trials. We abandon that scientific and ethical discipline at our peril.
So we have another question in the chat. What was the logic used to give the President of the United States experimental drugs that had not yet been determined to be safe and effective?
That is an excellent question. We don't know much about it, but we can say the following. It was an experiment because we don't, no one knows the results of the Regeneron antibodies. The remdesivir for the viral control has been shown to slow the progress of the disease, and there are even debates about whether that's actually been shown. And the dexamethasone is an anti-inflammatory used to prevent an overreaction of the immune system, which causes a lot of damage. So you want the immune system to respond, but to modulate that response so it doesn't become self-destructive. Now, the combination of all those three, from what I understand, there's no reported case of it, which means it was innovation. Now, what's the Society for University Surgeons standard? What the president's physician should have done by that standard is gone to an independent review for the innovation he was proposing. He's a member of the United States Navy Medical Corps. They could have set this up and set it up very rapidly. When I was the director of the Innovation Committee at Texas Children's Hospital for fetal intervention, we were able to review those proposals and get a response within 48 hours, and many of them were much more time sensitive than President Trump's apparent condition was. That's what he should have done. There is no report about whether he did that or not, so we do not know whether the president's physician followed the ethical standard for innovation that he should have followed.
So I've got two other questions that I want to ask you before I really open it up to the students. The first is, what is the most challenging COVID question you've had to deal with professionally? Or the most surprising, or?
Well, I work with Dr. Frank Chervenek, who's an obstetrician at Lenox Hill Hospital in New York City. And Lenox Hill, at one point in March, 80% of their beds were filled with COVID patients. This was very early in the experience, so how to effectively treat those patients, first to bring down mortality and then to prevent major morbidity, was not very well known at the time. So there was a lot of innovation going on. Some of it was on the fly. And I think in retrospect, we'll take a look at that at some point. But that, I think, was cautioning colleagues, just because it's desperate doesn't mean you do just anything. You've got to stop and think and come up with a plan of care that makes sense, that you can then evaluate based on its outcomes so that you can then improve it for the next patient. And the medical community rapidly adapted to that approach once they got experience. For example, putting patients on their bellies helped ventilation to be more effective. The remdesivir became available. Remember, early on that was not available. So you do the best you can in desperate circumstances, but you must keep your head. Physicians must always be thinking. When doctors stop thinking, usually bad stuff happens.
So your 80% number is, frightening in terms of what does this mean for people with other injuries or other needs that have to be seen by the hospital. And this could be an interesting ethical, dilemma for our healthcare providers in terms of how much resources do we provide for one disease or illness. With finite resources, what does that mean for others? I've read some studies about what this has done to cancer patients and their treatments that have been paused or surgeries that have been delayed.
Right. What hospitals did was they postponed what are called elective procedures. Now, what does that mean? It means that the patient would benefit from surgery, but that could be safely delayed. Now, what apparently also happened was people stopped coming into clinics and to hospitals on their own. And how much what is called hidden morbidity and mortality occurred as a result of that, people are still trying to figure out. So the problem was twofold. One, being very careful in what you define as elective. For example, here in Texas, the governor tried to define termination of pregnancy before viability as an elective procedure, and that did not succeed because termination of pregnancy is a time-sensitive procedure, and therefore it should not be labeled elective ever. That's a mistake. And so the worry about patients not going in, for example, delayed colonoscopies that could otherwise detect early colon cancer. And as you know, the earlier any cancer is detected, the more successfully it can be treated. That happened, and it has the medical community really worried about how they're going to catch up with these patients and get them to come back. Telemedicine has helped tremendously, although you can't do a colonoscopy by telemedicine.
Thank you. A comment in the chat. The administration has unfortunately marred the credibility and public view of medical safety organizations such as the CDC. Do you think that there should be some government body in future administrations that will prevent politicians in power to spread information contradicting medical advice from medical experts?
That's a really good question, is how we're going to prevent what happened. One way to explain what happened was that the current president of the United States did not fulfill his oath to faithfully execute the laws, which include public health laws in the United States at both the federal and state levels, and to enable the execution of those laws by propagating false information and attacking any scientist who disagreed with his policy. There was one quote in the paper saying what we had was policy-driven evidence rather than evidence-driven policy. So it really comes down to how do you hold a president accountable for his or her behavior in office. We only have two measures. One is impeachment and the other is elections. So the founders really thought that what they called men of virtue and integrity would rise and be elected. Remember that the president was not directly elected back then. Senators were elected by their legislators in their states. So there was a deep suspicion about direct democracy, which we still don't have because of the Electoral College. But we really have to count on the professional integrity and character of the person we elect to president to fulfill his or her oath of office. Now, I said we only have two measures for dealing with it when that fails.
So, following up on this question, there's also what's going on at the state level with governors having very different responses. And was wondering if you had any particular states where you were impressed with how the governors handled things or worried with how the governors handled things in terms of who they listened to.
Yes, well, I mean, one example would be the state of New York and the Commonwealth, as I learned to call it growing up there, of Massachusetts, where the governors implemented science-based public health policy, and they took the measures that were necessary to protect the public health, understanding that there would be serious economic consequences, but also understanding that the long-term solution to the economic stress was to have effective public health measures in place. By contrast, the governor of Texas did not do that and took an approach that emphasized more individual liberty and de-emphasized social responsibility to prevent harm to others. That's the harm principle in your handout. And as a consequence, the experience here was not good, and cases are rising again in Texas. They went down after serious public health measures were put in place. What's interesting in Texas was businesses led the way. Grocery stores, other places began to insist on mask wearing and social distancing. The grocery store that I use for 2 months, you had to stand in line for over an hour just to get into the store, because they literally controlled the number of people in the store shopping. A person could go in only when a person left. That has diminished now, but they would still require masks. And there's a person at the door, no mask, no entry. And so that's being enforced in the private sector. Now, there's a very good reason for that. One, the company that runs the grocery store is a socially responsible company, but you can also be sure their corporate legal counsel have told them you must do this, or you're going to, under what's called vicarious liability law in Texas, put yourself at tremendous risk of huge financial losses. So it's a combination of social responsibility and rational business self-interest. And we know what's happening in the upper Midwest, where governors still refuse to issue mask orders, even though, according to the New York Times this morning, the infection rate is as high as 80 people per 100,000, which in a pandemic is not good.
We have 2 more questions that have popped up. First is, early in the pandemic, PPE was in short supply. Frontline workers trying to treat COVID patients needed them to save lives, but laboratories trying to develop vaccines also needed PPE and could possibly save more lives down the line. How do you balance these needs?
The general notion is that if a patient is in imminent danger of death or serious disability and disease, that gets priority over longer-term prevention from a vaccine. So if you look at the handout where it says under public health, the primary prevention is prevention of the occurrence of disability, disease, injury, and death. That gets priority. The problem is there was no central control of the distribution of PPE, so it was chaotic. Some healthcare organizations had planned ahead of time, and they had stockpiled PPE as soon as the information was starting to come out of China that there was a problem. Others did not, and of course the supply system was overwhelmed. The federal government has the statutory authority to step in and manage that. It did not exercise that authority and left it to the states. The governor of Maryland reported that he found himself competing with other governors to get PPE for the healthcare professionals and scientists in his state. It was completely chaotic and a failure of responsible leadership on the part of the federal government.
We have another question. Would you comment on whether the CDC, independent of Trump, should have called for extreme action in January once they saw China lock down Wuhan and then the rest of the country? I don't know CDC or Fauci calling for extreme measures until it was too late. Interesting reporting on this in the Financial Times. How should such decisions be pursued in a multi-state democracy?
Excellent question. So the government of China is far more authoritarian, some think totalitarian than ours. So they actually, infected people were actually quarantined in quarantine hotels, as I understand it. They were not allowed to quarantine at home. Now that is a measure that would meet with open rebellion in the United States. It's a kind of power and authority that we would never give to our government. Even in disasters, we didn't do it. After 9/11, that didn't occur. So the public health, you're going to achieve primary prevention in what's called a culturally competent fashion. So the capacity of the Chinese government to undertake highly coercive measures, which by the way were very effective as far as we know, simply doesn't exist in the United States, and there are constraints on governmental power. So you have to appeal to the traditional notion of not just liberty, but responsibility. So we have our freedoms and we also have our responsibility. The great champion of this was John Stuart Mill, the English political philosopher in 1859 in his book on liberty, articulated the Home Principle. I have it here from the text. The only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised by any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. And so the government has the justification to do that. Now you want to make sure that it's going to work. So one criterion for public health measures is they have to be effective, which means they have to fit the cultural context. Is there a strong sense of social responsibility in American history? And the answer is yes. When the pandemic is over and you all get a chance to go out and visit rural areas around Williamstown, you will see barns built in the 19th century. Those were not built individually by the farm owner. The whole community would come out and raise the barn together. If a barn burned, they would immediately show up with hay, what was necessary, dairy cattle if they had been destroyed in the fire, and the whole community would chip in and rebuild. That tradition is very powerful and very strong. Here in Texas, the original Mexican settlers of Texas had voluntary societies for insurance and retirement. So this tradition goes way, way back. It's a multicultural tradition in the United States. And when it's called on, Americans respond. So you wouldn't need extreme measures, you'd need effective measures. And remember, if you wear a mask, you're benefiting yourself as well as others. If you maintain your social distance, you're benefiting yourself as well as others. So you can combine an appeal to rational self-interest and social responsibility, and that works. Remember, after 9/11, we were all taught, if you see something, say something. Very simple to do. If you're at the airport waiting for a flight, someone seems to be acting oddly, you go up to the desk agent and say, well, this guy sitting next to me is acting very strange. I'm a little concerned about my safety. Then measures are taken to deal with that. It doesn't put you at any risk to go up and talk quietly to a desk agent at a departure gate in an airport. So we know what to do. Those traditions are already deeply embedded in American history and our multicultural society, and we can call on them. And that would have worked. We know that. States that have introduced mandatory measures like masking and social distance have seen their infection rates go way down. There's just a report out of New York City. I think it's just a handful of infected kids in over 10,000 tested. That shows that non-extreme but effective public health measures can work.
So we have a question in the chat that I was hoping somebody would ask. When the vaccine does become available, should businesses, schools have the right to enforce mandatory vaccination? And I'll change it to the state rather than just businesses and schools. I know in the Commonwealth, you must have a flu vaccine this year to go to school, and you might even need it if you're not going to school in person.
Right, remember, why do we do vaccination? And flu vaccine is a very good example. We do vaccines for two reasons. One is to prevent people from getting the flu, or if they do get it, prevent them from getting a severe version of the flu, and also to prevent them from becoming vectors of infection to others. Now, when I was at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston for 28 years, I taught in the Michael E. DeBakey Veterans Affairs Medical Center, a 600-bed hospital. Patients in the VA system have multiple diagnoses, and if they're sick enough to be in the hospital, they are very frail and needed to be cared for very expertly, which the Baylor faculty and the nurses and the others at the VA did consistently. What is not permissible is someone comes in a patient's room who is a vector for the flu, who's got heart, kidney, and lung disease simultaneously. You could kill that patient. So the policy at Baylor College of Medicine was, unless you have a written excuse from your physician, you are not being allowed anywhere in a clinical setting to come to work without the flu vaccine. And if you can't be vaccinated, you're going to take measures to stay away from patients. So that's very well understood. What does that mean? Again, it's the same thing. You're appealing to rational self-interest. The vaccine helps you. You're appealing to social responsibility. You can help others while helping yourselves. The burden of fulfilling that social responsibility, therefore, is very small. And that means that the harm principle becomes very powerful. Because if I can prevent harm to others while benefiting myself, then surely that's what I should be willing to do.
So related to that is, obviously, when the vaccine comes out and becomes available, if we do get one, we're not going to have 10 years of data on long-term effects. So what if you have somebody who says, I am in an extremely low risk group, I don't want the vaccine for myself, I still want the ability to go to school, and all the teachers can be vaccinated if they want, and all the other students can be vaccinated if they want.
Because that won't, the if they want won't work as a public health measure. So again, if you want to, you can't base public health ethics on individual rights, or in the language of ethics, individual autonomy, because you won't achieve the goals of primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention as defined in the handout. It just won't work. So public health ethics discounts individual autonomy. That's the logic of it. But it does that in the case of a vaccine because you will be benefited. And by the way, your belief that you're in a low risk group may not be true. You might, for example, have asymptomatic hypertension, which puts you in a higher risk group. So the belief that one is low risk may not be evidence-based, but rather a form of enthusiasm. So again, it's the notion this is really an important take-home lesson from this. Public health ethics does not put the priority on individual autonomy. It puts the priority on social responsibility and public safety to achieve primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention.
Which means we probably need a very high level of confidence in the vaccines and their long-term effects before we go through with something like this, or we need to be having an epidemic with a much higher death rate.
That is correct. No, we must have confidence, by the way, and there needs to be careful study, follow-on study of a selected population to determine if there are some long-range effects that show up, which would then have to be evaluated. Remember, it's a judgment that whatever those complications are, if we are achieving primary prevention through vaccine herd immunity at that point, then those risks may be worth taking. So remember, a safe vaccine doesn't mean completely safe. It means that its risks are worth taking because we're achieving a greater public health benefit. We actually use the word safe enough. We should put safe enough. And we need our leaders to model that. So we need the President of the United States and his family on television being vaccinated, for example. We need every member of the Congress to do the same, and their families, governors, mayors, city council members, all the way down the line. This has to be done publicly. People have to support it. I mean, and then the skeptics then have to be addressed.
We've got a few other questions coming in. So we've got one, China has already approved and expanded its usage of experimental vaccine throughout China and to other nations. Any comments?
I don't know the situation well enough to know whether they have followed the international standards for a phase 3 trial. If they have and it's gone through appropriate approval processes, then they've got a vaccine to use. Remember, they have a 1.1 billion, is it, people they've got to vaccinate. That's going to keep them busy for quite a while. That's going to take many, many months to get that done. But I don't know if that's true.
So we have another question. Do you believe the pandemic will change the way we react to or view a public health crisis in the future, especially in regards to the way the pandemic has been politicized in the media? Has the pandemic already changed any pre-existing systems?
Oh, that's a really good question. Remember, there's no living memory of anything like this because the last one was the so-called Spanish flu in 1918 and 1919 that killed many thousands of people here and millions around the world. So we have no living memory. So we have to rely on historical memory. This is where the study of history becomes really, really important because we have to, instead of relying on memory, rely on historical reports from good historians about what happened, what we did, what worked, what didn't work, what we can adapt to our own circumstances. And I remember very vividly in 1981 and 2 when the HIV virus was first being described with patients showing up with Kaposi sarcoma, that is a skin cancer. And people got very nervous. And I remember Edmund Pellegrino, very distinguished founder of the field of bioethics, recently deceased, and on the Georgetown faculty with me at the time, gave grand rounds, which is a weekly lecture in the Department of Medicine. And he had living memory of being put at risk by his patients because he lost a year of his medicine residency to TB, tuberculosis, which he caught from patients at Bellevue Hospital in New York City, where he was doing his residency training in internal medicine. And he role modeled for very nervous students and residents who had no living memory of this, what courage is. That should you worry about being infected? No. If you follow infection control, if you gown, mask, and glove, the risk of transmission of HIV is infinitesimally small. Therefore, step up, act like an adult, and take on the minimal risk of infection. And that had a huge effect on the anxiety level and in the Georgetown Medical School and Georgetown University Hospital. So that's what we need. We need just those kinds of people. And in this case, we need the historians to step up and show us what was done and how we can replicate that sense of social responsibility and deal with these.
So because you're talking about history, I am going to play the Rank Cathet's privilege card and put my question above the queue in the chat. Do you want to talk a little bit about the ethics of using data that was obtained from horrible Nazi research and experiments in World War II?
That was a huge controversy back in the 80s. And I think from that came two responses. One was to recognize that much of the so-called scientific research done by the Nazi doctors was not scientific at all. And the results were very unreliable. Second, 3 points. Second, those that looked results from that do look like it would pass scientific muster can be replicated. So the science could be done again and done right this time. And so there is no need to use it. We can replicate the research. Sure, it's going to cost money, but to avoid a moral evil of that kind, it's worth every penny. And the third thing was to remember that during this war, World War II, in the United States, we were doing similar experiments with scientific protocols and with informed consent. So for example, in aerial bombers, the B-25 and the others that flew above the level where you can breathe, get enough oxygen there, you have to breathe bottled oxygen. They weren't pressurized cabins and they weren't heated. So they were very cold. And you've seen those bomber jackets that are fleece lined. There's a reason for that. It's to maintain upper body heat, trap that heat so the pilot doesn't freeze to death. It became very important to know about human performance in high altitude, freezing cold conditions. The US Army Air Force did scientific experiments with consent on American military personnel to learn the answers to those questions. So it was possible to do it right from the beginning. Remember, we were in a war of national survival, the last one we've ever fought so far. And so the urgency of getting those results, especially when the bomber crews flying out of London had a 60% loss rate. It was very important, out of England, I'm sorry, it was very important to know how human beings performed under those conditions, but it was done safely, effectively, and rapidly, and then introduced now pressurized planes like the Enola Gay that dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, that obviated that problem.
Just briefly before getting to the next question, I have a close family member who died from radiation poisoning as part of the Manhattan Project, where they just did not know what the consequences and long-term effects of this would be. So lots of different research questions going on. So the next question is, somebody has 10 ICU beds in their hospital, thus I can have no more than 10 patients on ventilators. Ideas have been floated such as having more than one patient on a vent, but none of these ideas are practical. What do I do this winter, spring if I have more patients requiring respiratory support due to COVID than I have ventilators?
Excellent question. So we know from New York City what happened. is that hospitals tried to prevent what's called triage. That is, invoking criteria to take someone off a ventilator who's already on one. And so what they did was they just kept creating critical care beds outside the physical confines of their then current intensive care units. And that worked. As far as I know, no hospital in New York ever had to go to triage. Now, there are accepted standards of triage in American medical ethics. And the standard is that if you can reliably predict that a patient on a ventilator is going to have a very high mortality, that is 95% chance of not surviving, and you have a patient waiting to get in who has a much better chance of surviving, then it's permissible to do that because the standard of care for a patient with that kind of mortality is not prolonged life-sustaining treatment. And that's been consensus ethics in critical care medicine since at least 1995 when they put a statement out on this. So you're following bedside clinical ethics. This patient really isn't going to benefit from this anymore. And then you invoke public health ethics to maximize the effectiveness of your resources so you prevent mortality in the entire population of patients the hospital's trying to serve.
So we have one more question in the chat, and then I have one from my science fiction reading. What is the appropriate allocation approach to vaccine delivery when it first becomes certified and large quantities are not yet available? And you could do similarly with testing, when we have rapid testing, but that's not.
Well, I mean, you take part of it is in the military. The important thing is you've got to maintain the effectiveness of a unit. So that you triage care in a mass casualty event on that basis. So you take care of the people who are taking care of others first. So that would be every healthcare professional who doesn't have a medical contraindication. Officials who are essential for the functions of government would be important to do. People at high risk, for example, in nursing homes or VA hospitals and the like, who can be safely vaccinated. That's going to be a medical question that our physicians will have to answer for us. And so you would go through at-risk populations first until you got to the so-called general population. And depending on how rapidly the vaccine becomes available, how many doses can be created, that may only be a phenomenon that lasts a couple of months before the vaccine becomes widely available for everyone who wants it.
So it's my understanding that you are not allowed to sell your organs. Is this correct?
In the United States, that's correct.
So I was wondering if you want to talk a little bit about the ethics of, should people have a right to either sell their organs or, more appropriate for COVID, to volunteer for financial compensation to participate in studies to get things done faster?
Okay, let's do the second one first, is compensating research subjects for participation. There's been a long-standing view in research ethics in the United States that we will not do that for fear of creating a financial incentive that could become unduly influential, especially for people of modest economic means. And so, and we can get clinical trials enrolled sufficiently to test the hypotheses without having to do that. So that, I think, is fairly straightforward. Steve, the first one again was?
The other one was about selling organs. You know, if you have
selling organs. That's a really complex philosophical question that starts with, is your body your own property? And then it depends on what your concept of property is, and there are competing concepts of property. So if we start with John Locke, who said that property is what you own when you mix your labor with nature, like you go out and you chop down a tree, and then you chop it up into firewood, that's your property. You can use it yourself or sell it to others or in barter or for money. Do we own our bodies in Locke's sense? And the answer would be no, we don't. But then there's the use notion of property. Do I have the use of it? And in that sense, yeah, my body probably is my property. So the first question is, remember, you can't sell something if it's not your property. You got to own it in order to be able to sell it. The second is, would that increase the supply of organs for transplant without creating financially coercive conditions? And that's partly an empirical question that would have to be studied very carefully with good psychological measures of whether people report that they're being coerced. And here I take my instruction from my former colleague at Baylor College of Medicine, who made the excellent decision to hire me there back in 1988, Baruch Brody, who died 2 years ago. And what Baruch taught us to think was, remember, financial incentives for people of modest means aren't necessarily coercive. They could be very good deals and allow someone to achieve some financial goals that would otherwise be out of reach. So that's a cautionary tale against the notion that compensating people for donating organs would always be coercive. Maybe not, maybe not. And so if we can work out the property issue and we can work out the potential coercion issue, and if some kind of limited experiment showed that we increased the number of organs for and tissues for transplantation all came out, then the argument against selling organs collapses.
Well, I think there's even been some cases where families might have additional children, hoping that some of those organs could help a child who already has a trouble.
Right. There the issue is, why should people have children? To which there is no stable answer. Many faith communities say you should have children so you people the world with the children of God. And that's the Judeo-Christian tradition. Others have other reasons. They want to make sure they have someone who will inherit their name and estate. And on and on. Countries have manipulated fertility. The Soviet Union did this during World War II. Abortion was outlawed because they needed the maximum number of people to fight the German army. After the war, those laws were relaxed. Philosophically, there's no convincing argument about why anyone should have children. Given that, to criticize someone for having a child for the purpose of helping another child simply collapses. There's no good argument to tell parents they should or should not procreate for that reason.
Well, unfortunately, it is after 11:30. Thank you very much for, even if only virtually, returning to Williams.
It was a real pleasure. Thank you.
And then if anybody has additional questions, please just email me and I will, help set up, getting the questions to the right person. I will be sending an email later today with some interesting science fiction episodes that deal with all of these medical ethical issues, at least a lot of them. Not surprisingly, they will be coming mostly from Star Trek Voyager, where the most interesting character in my mind is the holographic doctor. So everyone have a great day, and I will see you all on Wednesday.
Bye-bye.